Hey everyone, and welcome to this series of conversations with people who chose to speak out and ask difficult questions during the COVID era. At first glance, you might think this is a podcast about COVID. In reality, it's about something much bigger. It's about freedom of speech, intellectual honesty, and the right to question official narratives. It asks these fundamental questions. Do people have the right to challenge consensus? Is it ever justified to silence dissent in the name of public health, especially when those raising concerns are qualified to do so? And what kind of society do we become when fear replaces open dialogue? These conversations aren't telling you what to think. They're an invitation to listen with an open mind and an open heart. You may not agree with every viewpoint shared here, but we hope you'll agree on one thing. A healthy society depends on the freedom to ask questions, explore alternatives, and speak without fear of persecution. The information shared in this podcast represents the personal opinions and experiences of the guests and is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice and should not be relied upon as such. The host does not endorse or promote specific medical claims or treatments. Always seek the advice of qualified healthcare professionals with any questions regarding medical conditions or health decisions. The UK government and NHS state that COVID-19 vaccines authorised for use in the UK meet regulatory standards for safety, quality and effectiveness and are offered to those at higher risk. Any views expressed that differ from official guidance are personal opinions and should not be taken as medical advice. Listeners or viewers should consult NHS sources or healthcare professionals for individual health decisions. Hey everyone, and welcome to COVID Skeptics, a podcast that celebrates those true skeptics who stood up and spoke out against the COVID narrative, often at a great personal and professional cost. This is an opportunity to hear their stories, what it was like to speak out at that time, whether they feel vindicated now, and what lessons we can learn moving forward. My name is Shirley Blanche, and today I'm really delighted to be joined by the inspirational Dr. Gary Sidley. Gary is a former NHS consultant clinical psychologist. He's an author and was a vocal critic of the unethical use of behavioural psychology during the pandemic. He's also a member of the Heart Group. He does a lot of work on masks, which I think we'll be talking about today as well. Gary, welcome to COVID Skeptics.
Oh, thank you, Shirley. Good to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So I'm so fascinated to talk about all these things with you. But before we begin, in case anybody wants to turn around and say that you're not qualified to talk about the topics we're discussing today, could you just give us a little bit of background about what your background is and your sort of qualifications and everything like that?
Okay, I'll try and do the short version. But reel me in if I get too extensive with this. Left school at 18, went into pure sciences, did a degree in biochemistry and physiology at Leeds University. Got my degree in, God knows when, but after 3 years got my degree. Decided by then I didn't really want to go into pure science, and I was particularly interested in mental health and psychology. So I kind of switched direction, went into psychiatric nursing to earn a living and get relevant experience of mental health. And at the same time, I did an open university degree in psychology. So that's 5 or 6 years, part-time degree in psychology. Worked in mental health as a psychiatric nurse from 1980 up until 1987. So I started off as a kind of, I suppose, poorly paid assistant on a lot of the elderly wards, what they called psychogeriatric back in those days. But then qualified as a psychiatric nurse and went up the ladder a bit, working mainly with adult mental health, people with psychoses and unusual experiences, let's say. And then in 1987, I left and went to do my clinical psychology training, qualified in 1989, and then worked in predominantly adult mental health as a clinical psychologist in the NHS until 2013, I think it was, when I opted for early retirement. I tended to work with people with more severe mental health problems, and particularly those at high risk of self-destruction. So I did a lot of stuff on risk. My doctoral thesis, written up in 2000, was on some of the psychological underpinnings of self-harm and self-destructive behaviour. So I've always had an interest in risk assessment and risk aversity, etc. Towards the end of my career in mental health, for the last 10 years probably, I was actively engaged in-house in a kind of battle with the biological psychiatrists. I thought their model of human distress was fundamentally flawed, indeed quite harmful in many ways. So I kind of was very much into looking at alternative ways of making sense of distress and more appropriate ways of trying to help people. And when I retired in 2013, I continued to actively participate in that kind of movement to try and get mental health kind of revolutionised, really, to move away from that idea of illness like any other, that mental illness is down to brain biochemistry and all that, which I think is really unhelpful and often inaccurate as well. So I spent my time lecturing and doing presentations, trying to look at alternative ways of dealing with human distress.
And you wrote a book, didn't you, as well?
I did, yes, which was quite cathartic actually, Shirley. Back in 2015 it was published, Tales from the Madhouse, it's called, an insider critique of psychiatric services, which was really useful, or for me anyway, because it gave me that kind of opportunity to express my views about a whole variety of things and illustrate it with many anecdotes from my time within the service. So yeah, I'm quite proud of that. Obviously, never became a bestseller, of course. So I don't remember any real.
Yet, you never know.
Any real money, yeah. And but I was actively engaged in that movement, the alternatives to biological psychiatry,
which I think is being more and more vindicated as time goes on.
Yes,
there's a lot
definitely
more that's come out. I think you were sort of ahead of the curve a bit on that. Yeah. It's very interesting to know that you sort of had the sort of hands-on experience as well. I think that's really important, that you had all that sort of nursing experience as well. That's obviously really shaped the way that you view things. So you've retired. You obviously had like a little bit of an activist tendency anyway, to do the right thing. I'm guessing you were sort of motivated by the compassion that you had for the people that you'd been caring for. But so when COVID hit, what did your life look like at that time? So you were doing what sort of lecturing, training?
Yes, I was involved alongside many other colleagues with lecturing and doing workshops and the like, promoting alternative ways. And I've done various books, edited a couple of books and book chapters and all that kind of stuff, writing articles. I've always been into writing things down. And the really interesting thing for me, which still perplexes me in many ways, was that here I was up until 2020, for the previous probably 15 years, really actively engaged alongside my colleagues, fighting this tyranny, as we would call it, in psychiatry, of biological psychiatry, where the biological psychiatrists were usually top of the shop, had all the power and all the influence, but were behaving, in our view, in a very destructive way. So working alongside my colleagues fighting this for many years, and then COVID came along, the COVID event, let's say, came along in early 2020. And I just could not believe that the large majority of my colleagues who've been fighting this tyranny in mental health just went along with the dominant narrative, despite the parallels, the parallels between what we were fighting in psychiatry and the kind of global tyranny under the COVID banner were just so striking. You know, the kind of human rights infringements, you know, the coercion, big pharma, the egregious big pharma pushing their wares at the expense of people's health, vilification of those who express dissent. You know,
the same playbook.
The parallels were striking. Yeah, I remember writing an article back in the day around that time, calling it was "Tale of Two Tyrannies," because I said, you know, arguing that these very similar. Just the COVID one was just a much bigger tyranny.
It's a fascinating turn of events, isn't it? That the number of people that would normally see through something that suddenly became very compliant, which I think speaks very well to some of the techniques that were used and the way that they were used as well. And so for me then, tell me because I first came across you when you'd written a letter to the British Psychological Society regarding the sort of unethical use of, you know, behavioural psychology during the sort of trying to promote some of the pandemic policies that were out there. But what was the first thing that you sort of saw? Was it a sort of like straight away, did you kind of become quite sceptical around the narrative that was being put out? Or what was there a particular point that you sort of thought to yourself, this is where I need to speak out? Because it must have taken quite a lot to sort of step out and speak up.
Yes, and in all honesty, initially when I spoke, I was speaking out under an anonymous social media banner in the very early stages, which kind of testifies to how much kind of harassment really that you received around that time. But in answer to your question, I think it was a more was it gradual? Maybe not. I started to get kind of interested and worried probably late December 19 and early January 20, because you could kind of see things were brewing, and even a lot of talk about viruses and China and various things. And I've often reflected, I've often been asked about why I kind of recognised what was going on quite early doors, because as I've admitted several times in other interviews, I was very naive in this, as far as what was going on in the world up until that time. Okay, I fought the biological psychiatrist for many years, but that was my little niche as far as the worldwide kind of goings on. Compared to many other people, I was naive. I just worked hard, got my head down, tried to better myself, tried to better the life of my family. Generally believe that politicians and political leaders were, at least in broad terms, concerned about us and trying to do what's best. Really naive, Shirley. And I didn't.
Same.
I could recognise there was incompetency around the edges and stuff, but by and large, I thought, they were trying to do the right things in difficult circumstances. So not sceptical at all. Just head down and working hard until that time. And as to why that did it for me, I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect it was probably a number of things. I think one was that, having worked in mental health and focused on the areas that I did, I was always very much into risk, as I mentioned in our preamble before, and also how bad we are at assessing risk, both whether it's of suicide or risk of violence. So therefore, I was already tuned into any kind of risk aversion, which is a real kind of negative in mental health. A lot of risk aversion just suffocates people and stops people kind of growing and stops people having opportunities to make mistakes and move forward, because it's concerned kind of ultra concerned about kind of what if something bad happens. So it's quite, my antennae were out for that. I also recognise what big pharma were like, and the most egregious industry in the world, without a shadow of a doubt. And also, particularly in my nursing career, I had worked for, or alongside, let's say, for various periods, people in our infection control department. Excuse me. And I don't want to tar them all with the same brush or rubbish them. Many of them well-meaning and worked very hard, but they typically did have this very blinkered view of life, and could only see microbes and could only see their bit, and didn't seem to be able to get a grasp of the bigger picture. So I was charge nurse on the psychiatric wards for a number of years back in the 1980s, and we used to have infection control coming on and say, "Oh, this is wrong. This is an infection hazard. This must change." And they'd come up with these recommendations, which were just totally absurd and unrealistic in that particular environment, because I was, like 35 gentlemen, all quite florally psychotic, really. And, to actually install the kind of restrictions that infection control wanted would just be impossible.
So your background set you up quite well then, didn't it, really? Because one, you'd become sort of very aware of, I guess, how hypervigilant to threat from infection some of the public health policies can be, so that it doesn't have a broader risk assessment for other harms to health. But also you'd had enough dealings with big pharma and other things that had primed you almost, do you think, so that when the COVID pandemic narrative came out, you were almost slightly in a more skeptical situation because you'd had those experiences previously. And it must have taken quite a lot for you to speak out. So when you started speaking out anonymously, what sort of things were you speaking out against? Were you just you were just conscious that...
Well, lockdown, when lockdown was looming, I spoke out about that, and I remember coming out with, I think I might have made an article, or certainly a line within an article about, does it really need to be like this? And the reaction to that was quite amazing, really. Just all this bile and criticism, and I was insensitive. I don't know. At worst, I think a murderer may have popped up there a couple of times. Old colleagues going, "Oh, you got this completely wrong, Gary. This is a terrible disease. It's wreaking havoc in hospitals. I know. I've heard this. I've heard that." And I was kind of arguing around. Well, we can quibble about the kind of the level of risk, but why are we just completely moving away from all the pandemic management policies that have been on the books for decades? Why have we suddenly abandoned all those? And for lockdown, and obviously in time masks and masking healthy people, all this nonsense, that was clearly going to do far more harm than good.
Because it was very fascinating, wasn't it? Because we did have pandemic preparedness, and that's what Sweden did, didn't it? It went forward with the sort of policies that everyone had normally had, and suddenly there was this sort of massive change away from all the things that had been known before. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to call this podcast COVID Skeptics was because I think people that were genuinely skeptical at that time were almost called science deniers. They were almost shamed for being skeptical or asking questions, which I thought was the sort of one of the fundamentals of the scientific method, was to actually ask questions and to query things. So it was strange for me to see people not being allowed to speak up. So it obviously got to a point where you went from being anonymous and criticising things to actually coming out and just saying, right, okay. So what was your motivation for that? Was it just frustration? Was it just a sense of wanting justice? I mean, what would you say that you're...
Yeah, again, several things really, Shirley. I think definitely was frustration, but also I thought, come on, don't be a coward, Sidley. And as the so-called pandemic progressed, it became increasingly clear that unless more and more people were willing to express visible dissent, not behind an anonymous kind of icon or no, but actually stick the name to it and go, I disagree with this. I do not wish to comply with this, and put your name on it. I thought we're never going to get out of this. We're never going to be able to counter this. So whereas up until, I can't remember the exact date now, but it might have been sort of mid-March 2020, I'd been on social media under a kind of a pseudonym, got into some very kind of heated and prolonged battles and disputes with a whole variety of people, which often got received quite a lot of abuse in that. But it was anonymous, but I thought, no, I'm going to stick my name on this, so I scrapped that and just went out as Gary Sidley, and predictably I got called. It's terrible. Somebody who's worked in the NHS and now not behaving in this reckless, irresponsible manner. They should know better. I just get quite a lot of patronising kind of comments such as that from psychologists, medics, and various other.
How did your sort of friends and family react, though? Were you sort of broadly supported, or was that an additional strain as well?
I was fortunate in that, and in that my wife similarly skeptical, still is. So I had that. Again, I had skeptical friends who didn't have that, and that must have been particularly difficult, where it split up families. I won't name them top of my head now, but for their own confidentiality. But I can think of people who are still actively skeptical now, who I know their family have kind of split down the middle. They've been like mum and two of the offspring have gone one way, and the other three have gone the other way. It's quite a divisive topic.
Yeah,
really tearing families apart. So that must have been difficult. So at least I had that. Most of them, as I've said, large majority of my colleagues that I worked with, who I was still in contact with, bought into the dominant narrative. So that was difficult, and quite sadly, inevitably, you grew apart. There was a small cluster of previous colleagues who were kind of very hostile and very, very hypercritical of me at that time. But mostly it was kind of, I suppose, just drift apart and stop talking to each other and stop communicating and stop meeting up. And on the occasions when one might meet up, it was like the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And so that's been quite difficult.
Do you think any of them have changed their minds?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I suspect they have. But it's one thing changing one's mind, and another thing admitting it publicly, isn't it? I think that takes a lot of bravery. And that's why, just in response to, I think, something you said earlier about that people who are sometimes expressing scepticism now who were expressing scepticism at the time, and I can share that kind of where we're kind of mentality. But the other bit of me thinks, well, in some ways, people who do change from being kind of on board with the dominant narrative to being sceptical and expressing sceptical views and holding their hand up and saying they got it wrong, when that's from a genuine place, I do kind of respect that, because I think that's important.
100%.
And also, perhaps even more importantly, Shirley, I think that potentially has a bigger influence on other people who are listening to that conversation.
Definitely.
Somebody who's pushing masks, pushing lockdowns, and being critical of skeptics, who then sometime down the line is going, yeah, no, I really regret that now. I got that wrong. It's from a place of integrity. I think there are some who do it to save their own
100%.
backside sometimes, but people who are genuine about that, I think they have a potentially disproportionately positive benefit on trying to change minds, which I think is what we're trying to do ultimately.
Definitely. And also, it was really hard for some people. Some people, their livelihoods were depending on it. I think some people almost wanted to convince themselves just so that they didn't feel that anxiety of speaking out, because there's a real strong psychological manipulation in play, isn't there, in terms of we all want to feel like we belong to the tribe. We don't want to be ostracized. We don't want to be pushed out, sort of from an evolutionary perspective. There's something very deep rooted in us to want to belong to a group and everybody agreeing that we're a good person and feeling that way. And it's very, very uncomfortable, which is why I have so much which I'm just so grateful for people like you for speaking out, because it's a really tough thing to do. So you kind of, you spoke out, you got pushback, but then you went a little bit further because you did become quite public. I remember seeing you having written this letter to the BPS. How did that come about? Because you had other people that joined you that signed this letter. What was that all about?
Yeah, because by that time I'd joined up with organisations like HEART, the Health Advisory and Recovery Team. So I'd found fellow skeptics and people who were equally energetically opposed to what was going on, including medics and various other lawyers and others. So that was really helpful. And online, I'm quite critical of online stuff, and I much prefer face-to-face contact in many ways. But one thing that it did do back in those dark days in March, April 2020, it was about the only way you could find any sanity, I found, was on Twitter, as it was called then, and other online platforms, to actually connect with people who had a similar viewpoint. Otherwise, I think I thought I was going insane. And therefore, I'd gathered around me quite a large group of people of similar perspective, and some of whom were psychologists and various clinical, educational, and we were hypercritical of the psychological manipulation that was being conducted by the government's experts and the behavioural scientists, and plus all the so-called psychological, well, not so-called, they were psychological experts sitting on things like the SBIB, the subgroup of SAGE that dealt with the communication stuff. A lot of those were members of the British Psychological Society, quite prominent people in the BPS. So I felt very strongly about that, as did a number of my colleagues. So looking around, what could we do? Well, the British Psychological Society, of course, is supposed to be the kind of the overseer of ethical practice of the discipline, for all clinical psychologists and other psychologists in the UK. It is the professional body, and one of their explicit roles is to ensure that their discipline is being applied in an ethically sound way. So I thought, well, perhaps they have something to say about this. But as you'll know, despite three or four letters to various people, including the BPS, and pushing to get it considered by their ethics committee, and highlighting the ethical misdemeanors of a lot of the nudges that were going on, particularly around use of fear, shaming, and so-called normative pressure, which of course very quickly flips over into scapegoating. Basically said the BPS should formally say something about this, and but of course, when they did eventually reply, it was all very defensive, and all they're immensely proud of the work of their psychologists, and the same ethical rules around things like informed consent don't apply when it's a public health issue, and just rejected it. But it was a worthwhile process because I think it did get quite a lot of traction at the time, and a couple of newspapers, including the Daily Telegraph, I think, picked up on it, which was quite unusual back in the day. Because all the mainstream media just didn't really want to go there.
Were you surprised, though? Were you surprised that the BPS were sort of advocating for these sort of psychological tactics? Because from an outsider's perspective, I was just thinking some of the adverts that were put out were pretty, look them in the eyes one. I'm just thinking of that one, and they were very emotionally manipulative, and I felt like they didn't take into account just the levels of fear at that time that were being pumped out daily. People were being isolated. We're locked down in our homes. You've got your daily briefings. We've got the death counts. There were so many things to pump fear into people, and I have a history of health anxiety myself, and so I was sort of very hypervigilant to things like that, and knew that I had to put things into place in my life. So I wouldn't watch the briefings. I wouldn't, I limited the amount of social media that I allowed in, and did lots of things myself, but only because, I've learnt about those things and I know that those things help me. But I was conscious that there'd be a lot of people out there that wouldn't be aware of that and who would be very vulnerable to their mental health suffering, but also their physical health suffering, because you cannot separate the two. If you're in a state of fear and you're in that level of stress, that's going to impact your immune system. You're going to be more vulnerable to getting more ill from COVID. So I was quite shocked by it, and I was quite shocked that no one was sort of standing up and speaking out against it. So were you surprised that the BPS were so unethical or sort of supported those practices?
Like, I should have been surprised, but if I'm honest with myself, I wasn't, because I kind of could see the way that they were drifting, the way the BPS had made pronouncements about the terrible pandemic. So I wasn't particularly surprised that they rejected it, but I couldn't see any rational reason why they should reject it. And you're right, just the unethical use of fear was just totally unacceptable. And you mentioned the look them in the eyes adverts, which were abhorrent. And I did subsequently delve into that very deeply, the people who were behind that, and published quite a number of articles about the look them in the eyes. And to cut a long story short, when you actually dig into it, and through freedom of information requests and the like, a whole lot of sifting through documents, we actually uncovered the official justifications that the Cabinet Office used for pushing that out without any kind of ethical constraints at all. There were three that stick out. I think one was there was how did they describe it? A small subgroup of people who were kind of grossly underestimating the risk of COVID. So various estimates. Sometimes it's 1 in 10, sometimes it was less. But there was a group that were out there, and they needed to be kind of addressed and challenged and changed, targeted at them. A second justification, and this comes from freedom of information requests, so this includes behavioural scientists in the Cabinet Office and their advisors. It's all documented. One of the others was that younger people believe they are less vulnerable.
Which they were.
Which they were, of course, exactly. So that's the fact. But the one that took the biscuit for me, the third justification for why they pushed this at the whole population, many of whom were already overly kind of scared and full of fear because of all the stuff, some of which you've touched on, was that, and I can give you the word for word this at a later day if you're interested, but it was along the lines of the levels of fear in January 2021, which is when the look them in the eyes adverts came out, the level of fear around that lockdown in January 2021 was not as high as it was in March 2020. That people had seemed to be kind of finding ways of functioning, and weren't taking, implication was it they weren't taking it seriously enough.
So what
Which
was
I thought, wow, that is horrendous.
What was the purpose of that, though, do you think? I mean, the making everybody really scared is just to make people compliant, isn't it? Surely, it was, because didn't something come out around Matt Hancock? Weren't there some WhatsApp messages or something saying we need people to be more fearful, or, something along those lines?
Yeah, there's a few quotations from Matt Hancock back in the day about I think it was something along the lines of, when are we going to kind of release the new variant and scare the pants off people? I think was words, scare the pants off people. So fear has been used very widely by the government during the COVID event, by their experts. But you've touched on some of the methods with the daily death counts and the look them in the eyes adverts and the various mantras, etc. Interestingly, when you get engaged with some of the behavioural scientists and some of the BPS, Psychological Society people, about the use of fear, they deny point blank that they actually resorted to fear. They said we never advised that. That wasn't how we're doing. Which is nonsense, really, because when you do sift through their outputs, we look at the SPI notes throughout the COVID event, there's multiple examples where they've talked about using fear as a way of getting people to comply. And of course, the nudge unit, the behavioural insight team, which is probably the most notorious source of behavioural science. They are widely used. Fear.
I think for anybody that doesn't know about nudging, you're a bit of an expert on nudging. So for anybody that doesn't really know what nudging is, can you give a quick breakdown of what that is?
Yeah.
Because it's not just a new thing, is it? This is what shocked me, actually, is I didn't realise how much behavioural science was being used in the government anyway. I sort of understood during the pandemic that it was something that had been really ramped up during David Cameron's time, but I think it possibly was being used before then.
Yeah, it certainly got some greater impetus back in David Cameron's time. The nudge unit of the behavioural insight team was formed back in the day when David Cameron was Prime Minister. So they got a big, he was really into it and really pushed the approach. As far as for definitions, I think probably the simplest one is to say nudge is a psychological strategy of influence that acts on its targets without them being fully aware that they are being influenced. So
where's the informed consent?
Well, exactly. That goes out the window, doesn't it? So whereas back in the day, the argument would be that politicians and advisors would try and influence people through rational arguments and giving information and saying, oh, this is why we think we should be doing this, blah, blah, blah. Behavioural science and nudging, not always, because some of them people are aware they're being targeted, but a lot of it, they're not aware they are being influenced. It's below the level of consciousness, and it exploits people's biases. It exploits humans' shortcuts that we use, cognitive shortcuts. The problem being, of course, our world is so complex and so much going on that we can't focus and reflect on every little minutiae of our environment. So what we do is we've got shortcuts, we've got these heuristics that we use to jump to conclusions, to kind of minimise effort. And most of us, and you'll know this being a mindfulness expert, most of us spend probably 99% of our time, well, all of us spend 99% of our time in autopilot, where we don't really reflect on our day-to-day decisions, because if we did, we'd just be paralysed with doubt and uncertainty. So we just kind of go with the flow. And it's only now and again when we stand back and start to slow our thinking down and start to use reflection and to think about things more deeply. Majority of the time, it's that reflex stuff. And behavioural scientists exploit that. If people are frightened, they tend to comply. As you mentioned earlier, Shirley, we all like to be in the centre of the herd, or believe we're in the centre of the herd, even though it may be going off a cliff top. We find certain security of being there rather than being in a minority. So that was used, normative pressure, norms. That was a nudge that was widely used, where, give the impression that everybody else was wearing masks, everybody else was taking the vaccine, everybody else was following lockdown rules to the letter, and you were the outlier. You're the one who's the exception. So that was a nudge that was used very widely. The other one, a big one, ethically questionable one, is what they call the ego nudge. We all like to see ourselves as a good person. We'd like to think we're a decent human being. And the nudges, the behavioural scientists, used that, manipulated that, so to try and equate following the COVID rules with being a good person and not following them to be a bad person. For example, who can forget those horrible adverts around masks where you had these actors on the television who weren't saying things like, "I wear my mask to protect my mates," or even Hancock quipping things like, "Don't kill your gran," to university students coming back for the summer vacation. All that's exploiting this ego nudge, and ethically highly questionable.
And scientifically, the evidence around masking was, I think, quite early on shown not to be valid. And the narrative shifted quite a lot on that, where we weren't supposed to, where masks didn't make a difference. Certainly in the States, they had Fauci saying, you don't need masks, and then you need a mask, and then you need two masks, and then it all became sort of very ridiculous. I think it's really interesting what you pick up on the virtue signalling there, which we saw a lot of. I think also as well that seemed to be used as a tool to divide people as well, sort of a divide and conquer. So if somebody wanted to play into the whole ego thing and be very virtuous, then by reporting somebody or admonishing somebody who wasn't following the rules made them feel even better. But that was sort of just used to kind of divide everybody. I felt, that was another, whether that was a deliberate ploy or whether that was just a side effect of it being used. But it's very different from what we think of as traditional propaganda, isn't it? The nudging is not like normal propaganda, where everybody would see a message, but they'd maybe have an opportunity to believe it or not. It's really playing on your very basic, instincts of what it is to be a human being in a society, and manipulating those at their very core to make you behave in a way that you wouldn't do otherwise.
Yeah, I like to view it as being like an element of propaganda, a specialised element of the whole package, really. And that's why I'm so energetically opposed to masks, because I think it's wrong on so many different levels. As you've rightly said, evidence-wise, the so-called the science for the effectiveness of blanket masking rules is pretty flimsy at best, and that's before we start looking at the harms, and there are many of those, physical, social and psychological. But also, what masks, and this was known by the behavioural scientists, that's why many of them were quite positive about them, was that it helped to strengthen those three main nudges, the three ethically questionable ones: the fear elevation, the ego shaming kind of nudge, and the normative pressure about not wanting to be in a minority. So fear, of course, wearing a mask screams that one or both of us is a biohazard. So that's fear, and a bit more subtly, it does act as what I've called a safety behaviour. And by that I mean that when people continue to routinely wear masks, they never get a chance to find out that they would have survived even if they hadn't.
Yeah.
So everything becomes a kind of near miss. So if people who are already scared wear the mask religiously, go out and come back, and they don't succumb to some terrible illness, they don't think, oh, the world out there isn't as scary as I thought. What they think is, I just got away with it this time, a near miss, if I hadn't had my mask on. So masks are terrible for fear. They're terrible for ego, because it's a good way of virtue signaling, as you said, and I'm wearing my mask to protect others, and all this kind of messaging. And as I said, humans do like to see themselves as worthwhile individuals, and perhaps even more egregiously, they do strengthen the normative pressure nudge, because what it does is it allows instantaneous identification of the rule followers and the rule breakers. Immediately you can see who's following the rules and who isn't. So I've often said that if anybody kind of doubts the strength of normative pressure, then you've probably never had an experience of being the only unmasked person in a shop or something else packed with masked individuals, because the actual pressure is pretty palpable even before anybody says anything. Obviously, it starts to escalate once you start getting abuse, but even in silence, being the odd one out, which I can identify with quite a number of times back in the day. Been one in particular instance, been stood in a very busy butcher's shop with just prior to Christmas. Everybody getting the turkeys and that. And there must have been, I don't know, 70 people in this butcher's shop, and including the staff, everybody was masked up except me. I was the first thing, and it does. Just get your heart going, and you think, goodness, you're waiting for someone to say something.
So do you think that the thing with masking is that it wasn't just about public health policy? It was more a method of control, or maybe seeing how much control that, or do you think it was, to give them the benefit of the doubt? Well, maybe it's safer to mask than not to mask. Maybe if it stops somebody sneezing on somebody else, it's a positive thing. Or do you feel that there was something else behind it, and it was to see how easily the population would comply? Do you think there was an element of sort of data collection to see whether that was happening, whether it was a sort of demoralization tactic, or to keep the fear going?
Yeah, I think the controlling element was prominent. Yeah, I think it was certainly by some of our elite rule makers. That was definitely almost like a test to see, I think, if the population could be controlled in that way and forced to comply. Sadly, a large majority did, but. I think other people were just scared. I've often tried to divide it up into people who did comply with the various ludicrous restrictions, and I think different motivations for why people went along with it. Quite a significant number were genuinely very, very frightened. They believed themselves to be immune compromised and very vulnerable, and they would been told time and time again on the television that they'd get something terribly dangerous. They'd seen all these pictures of coffins piling up in Ecuador or wherever, and the insides of acute units with in A&E with people gasping for breath, and all these horrific kind of images.
We forget, I think, don't we, how they were going into, the sort of ICU units and filming in there. There was a level of propaganda there. And I remember my husband saying to me, and he doesn't often, speak out about things like that, but he was saying to me, I don't understand why they're filming it so it looks like they're in a war zone, and they're sort of running around and the cameras are sort of moving, and they're sort of running because you're in an ICU and everyone's in bed, so you're not in a war zone. But the way it was filmed, even being shown on the TV, he was quite astute in sort of picking up that it seemed to be made to be as scary as possible, as a deliberate fear tactic. And I always wondered, and you're probably a good person to ask about this, if you're in a real state of fear, does that make you more vulnerable to receiving messages on a sort of subconscious level? Does it make your brain absorb messaging more easily? Because I always wondered if it was almost like a form of hypnosis, that if you're in a fear state, your brain's not thinking clearly. So you're in a much more vulnerable state to be given messaging that you'll take on more quickly and won't even realise you're doing it. Is there any sort of validity to that?
Definitely, most definitely, Shirley. Yeah, when we're in a state of fear, that affects the way we process information in three big ways. Firstly, it affects what we focus our attention on. As it implied earlier, there's too much going on to take in everything, so we've got to be quite selective over what we're focusing on. But if you're already scared, you will kind of privilege sensory information out there that's scary. So any headline, any kind of somebody dying or some image, you'll focus on it much more effectively and sharply than someone who's not as scared. Secondly, it affects our interpretation of things. So if we're presented with something that's kind of ambiguous as far as I would make sense of it, if you're already scared, you will interpret it and make sense of it in a much more threatening way than you would be if you weren't scared. That's a robust finding throughout the psychological literature. And thirdly, when we're scared, it affects our memory. We selectively recall scary things. So if one's scared in the here and now, your access to scary things that you've witnessed or endured in the past is amplified. It's easier to remember scary things when you're already frightened. So in all those different ways, yeah, once someone is scared, it does affect the way they see the world, and it's much more likely that they're going to focus on and interpret things in a way that's going to make them even more frightened. So it's kind of escalates in that way.
And so the masks are really good visual for that, aren't they? To keep your focus.
Masks are just so egregious. Yeah, I can't state enough how bad masks are, because they're wrong on so many different levels. And one of the really frustrating things around masks, the way the pro-mask lobby, and they still do this, particularly in health and social care. It's only a mask. If it helps a little bit around the edges, what's the problem? You get that kind of thing. Well, we're talking about what the problem is, with fear and strengthening a lot of the nudges. One of the other big ones, though, as well, is it dehumanizes and it impairs our contact with fellow human beings. An arena which is starkly illustrates that is care homes. I don't know if you're aware, we've recently produced a film called Masking Humanity. Find it on YouTube, maskinghumanity.com. We're quite proud of it, actually. It's a 42-minute film.
I'll put a link in the description.
Brilliant, yeah. But it focuses on care homes, which I feel very strongly about. Both my parents died in care homes during the COVID event, and so I've got a personal investment in that. And when my father died, they weren't for letting me in for not wearing a mask, which I did kick off against, and eventually they allowed me in. But but in that environment, well, in any healthcare environment for that matter, but in social care with people with dementia and people who are already confused, to then put strips of plastic and cloth over people's faces, the carers, so they can't see any non-verbal communication, is the epitome of cruelty. And And I think the film, like I don't know, I'm pushing that now, but I think it's really worth a watch because it does bring home the human cost of masking and the way that so many of our elderly people have suffered, as well as others, of course. We know children suffer, their cognitive and verbal development skills were stymied. There's lots of robust evidence for that now by people being masked all around them. And health and social care, care homes, masking in there, just the epitome of cruelty. And it's really worth watching the film for just to get a grip of that, really, and get a grasp of the extent of that. And also linked to what you just said about people changing their mind as well, the so-called experts, because there was a whole raft of experts who back in early 2020, certainly between March and May 2020, don't wear a mask, won't work, do more harm than good. Jenny Harris, who's now lead person at the UK Health Security Agency, I think she was the assistant medical officer for England at the time. She said that. Chris Whitty said it. Valens said it. All this whole raft of people, and on the film, it's actually got the snippets of the videos where they're saying this thing, and then in June 2020, it all flip-flopped, and they all changed the tune all at once, all at the same time.
Which is the weird thing, isn't it? That's the thing that was really weird. For me, it was a bit weird just looking as an outsider. So what I would say, for people that really did comply, one, it's really hard when you're not a scientist to argue against the science, because you have to just believe what scientists say, because you're not a scientist yourself, especially if you've got no medical background, you don't know. But we were never presented with two sides of the story. When you watch the news, when you watched anything, you had the sort of you had the what did they call the BBC, where they were making sure that everybody said the same. Everyone was sticking to the narrative. The BBC was sort of compliant with that, and so with all the other media organisations. I can't remember what they called it now.
The fact-checking thing, you mean?
Yeah, the fact-checking, but they sort of had a whole group. They all kind of came together, didn't they? And they all said, we're going to all just sort of stick to the same narrative. Yeah. And so for me, for my brain, and I don't know if it's just because I just sort of maybe live more mindfully. I think mindfulness maybe really helped me during the pandemic, because I was able to come off of automatic pilot and look at things more rationally from a sort of an observer's perspective, which is what we sort of encourage in mindfulness. But one of the things that my brain was really missing was seeing the two sides, like seeing people have these two discussions. And I was used to being presented with two sides of an argument and then being able to make my own mind up. And I didn't see any of that during the pandemic, and that sort of made me feel unsettled. That unsettled my brain, because it didn't have the ability to be able to come to its own conclusions.
Yeah, a bit like the mantra about all scientists agree. That mass
trust the science and
trust the science. Yes, and of course, what that fails to address is the fact that all those scientists who were saying something different were censored and cancelled and targeted and smeared, in a big way, and still are being in many ways, whether it's about health or whether it's about something like climate now or other things that are quite controversial. This top-down control of so-called the science, and we just hear just one side of the argument, which is just appalling.
It just becomes propaganda at that point, doesn't it? It doesn't
Absolutely.
become. So moving on from masks, then. I mean, do you think that masks? It's just become more socially acceptable to have masks. Do you think we've got masks forever now? Do you think it's made it that much easier for the government to sort of say at any point, right, we mask up again and people be more compliant, because like you say, it's become more normalised behaviour? Do you think that's what we're in for in the future?
In some ways that's probably true. That's what David Alpen often says, the lead person for the nudge unit. He talks about a habit loop. I think our habit loop's been formed now, so we can kind of reapply this as and when we want now. On the flip side, on the positive side, from my perspective, is I'm without a doubt, I think far more people are sceptical now than they were back in 2020, and it's probably escalating all the time as the government continues to tell us gross lies, and and I think more and more people are just lost trust in our institutions and what they're actually saying. I take comfort from when I look at articles that pop up from time to time in the mainstream press, which either about mass maybe have to return to such and such a place, or this terrible new virus is about to wreak havoc. If you actually look at the comments and the response to it, 95% plus of the comments are taking the mick. They're ridiculing it. They're
I always go
laughing.
to the comments. I always go to the comments section first. It's very, very interesting. Do you think as well, sort of, when the sort of vaccine thing came, there was such a push for that as well. I mean, I think, do you feel that there was an element where they just so overreached there? That there was so much overreach that they maybe just pushed everybody too far at that point?
They did, yeah, with vaccines, but also it's not just with vaccines. I think the whole COVID kind of narrative was overreach, and if you look at it from a perspective of some global powers that are trying to gain control over the ordinary people, ordinary men and women of the world, I think even most of them would acknowledge that they went too fast. And people then started, like me, I guess, woke up and went, "Whoa, what's going on here? This is not right." If it had gone slower, a bit like the boiling frog thing, isn't it? You put a frog in cold water and turn up the temperature, it will just stay there and die because the temperature goes up slowly. If you drop it into a pot of boiling water without the graduation, it'll jump out to freedom. And in a way, it's the same. It's slow incremental change. People tend not to notice and tend to adapt to and accept until you realise you're in a real kind of difficult situation. So yeah, I think they did overreach. I think they did go too quickly. Encouragingly, I think there's far more people now who are questioning what used to be trusted institutions, Western institutions. We can trust them, can't we? They never use propaganda. It's only China and Russia that do that.
Yeah. Shocking.
Yeah.
I've just remembered it was the Trusted News Initiative was what I was trying to remember.
Of course, yeah.
Which is ironic, isn't it? Because I think no one trusts the news now, or very few people. Very few people.
Yeah.
So,
Exactly.
So we've got these nudge units. The nudge units still there, though, aren't they? I think that's what's really important for everybody to realise, that they weren't just pulled out for COVID and then they've gone away. The nudge units still exist, don't they?
They do, yes, and they're alive and kicking. And in the UK, for instance, as well as the behavioural insight team, the nudge unit that David Halpern leads on, that's very active, not just in the UK but across the world. There's different branches across Western Europe, in Australia, in Canada, America. They're all over the place. But the thing is, and a lot of people don't realise this, that in addition to that, and just leaving aside the SAGE groups, the SPIB and that, which were kind of transient groups, they came together during the so-called pandemic and then disappear. But if you look in all the departments, Shirley, of the UK government at the moment, you will find that virtually everyone has its own in-house behavioural scientist. We're talking about transport department, the tax office, the culture and sport one, etc., etc. Again, we did all this painstakingly with a freedom of information request to tease out, whether they did have behavioural science and how much they spent on it. It's very rare to have had a department that doesn't have these people in it. And our civil service is riddled with them. And on top of the in-house employees, they have this kind of countrywide Government Communications Service, GCS, they call it. Your listeners might want to look it up. You actually look at what they're up to. All these professional communicators. There's a significant number of behavioural scientists in that as well. So they're everywhere. There's not one aspect of our life that isn't being influenced in this way. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? They're paid for with our money. We're paying people to manipulate us. And whether, like I've said, whether it's in health, whether it's in transport, whether you're on the train or a bus, or whether it's about filling in your tax form, sport and culture, etc., etc., etc. We're being nudged.
And social media, only lends itself to that, doesn't it? Because that's a very good medium to use to help nudge people. Although it's a good medium to bring people together that questioning and exposing the nudges as well.
A double-edged sword, you're right. Yeah. Because I think you can resist these things more effectively in some ways. Like I said, back in the day, in 2020, it was a godsend, really, that you could find other like-minded individuals.
So in terms of, do you think anybody is ever going to be held responsible for the harms that were done? I've seen some of the COVID inquiry and it hasn't filled me with a great deal of hope that anybody's going to be held responsible for the mistakes that were made and the harms that were done. What's your view? Do you think?
It's looking unlikely, isn't it? Certainly in the near future. And I won't be surprised if what we witness is what's happened before with other scandals, whether it be about poisoned blood scandals or the post office scandals and things like this, is that eventually it's kind of common knowledge that the world went mad in 2020 and there was a lot of egregious forces at work. I think that will come out at some point, but sadly most of the key players will have moved on and may not even be with us by that time. So I hope I'm wrong. Because I think that is really important that there is some acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Or at the very least of having kind of erred in a big way, just some acknowledgement that we took the wrong kind of route on this. But I can't see that happening.
Do you think, though, there is more of an awakening now, though, because, let's think of some of the positives that have happened since 2020. I think, like you, I was just quite naive then, and I just sort of genuinely believed that government cared about us or would actually do its best to protect us and do the right thing. I was quite shocked, actually. I kept waiting for people on the left to speak up. That was something that really surprised me. The dissenting voices started to come from the right rather than the left politically, and I was quite surprised by that. Were you? Because I kept waiting for the left have always been like, let's speak up for people's rights. I thought in terms of bodily autonomy when it came to vaccination, in terms of informed consent, I just felt the left would be all over that, and they were sort of, they seemed to be pushing the narrative more than anybody else.
Yes, I share your kind of surprise and disappointment in that, and I shared that back in 2020 as well. Like yourself, it was a real kind of shock, and I have said before, in some ways I think the left-right kind of dichotomy now is probably less relevant. I think there's something about authoritarianism and people's level of comfort with top-down control. And like a paternalistic, state-driven control of our lives. I think it's more whether people are comfortable with that. Because interestingly, with the group of skeptics that I and my wife and got involved with and still are involved, they lost a lot of friends, but again a new set. And we're still meeting to this day socially and still discussing what's wrong with the world. 50% of that group was staunch left-wing people. So there are some left-wing politically active people who did see it, but you're right, the majority didn't. And So there's a group of 7 of us really that's together, and the 2 are very much left wing. There was me, who was probably central, right of centre, anything. So we wouldn't have had much in common back in the day, and been bound together by being able to see what's going on. And perhaps I did sound a bit too bleak and a bit too pessimistic. I think I've struggled to find it likely that people will be hauled over the coals in the next 3 or 4 years. I think probably there'll be some acknowledgement at some point. But like you said rightly, Shirley, there is more scepticism now. I'm a great believer in visible dissent. Like I think it's called Rochelle, I think, a Canadian journalist, once back in 2020 argued that we've got to break this illusion of consensus, which I thought was a good phrase, the illusion of consensus, the idea that the vast majority of people are totally on board with this this narrative, this COVID narrative. And he's right. I think visible dissent is the key. If we can get more and more people to not comply, to stick the name, as we were talking earlier in the interview, to put the name to something going, I don't agree with this. You don't need a majority to stop the authoritarian juggernaut. I think as little as 10-15% of the population doing that would probably be sufficient. You don't need to get a majority. So for me, it's so important that we keep that in mind. Those skeptics, when we're communicating in all our different niches and our different opportunities that we have, just to try and encourage people in a respectful way, not by ridiculing them, because that never changed anybody's mind. Converse, in fact, it makes them more entrenched and more likely to stay with the views. But those people who've got ambivalence, who haven't been fully skeptic, but have got ambivalence, and there's a lot of them, who can kind of see some of the inconsistencies and some of the irrationalities in what's gone on, but haven't yet spoken out about it. They try and get those on board, and in their day-to-day lives, to just take every opportunity to express dissent. And I've had this debate with colleagues before, and some people think it's not that important. I think it is really important, and would argue that in day-to-day life, just speaking personally, the opportunities do arise. I sat in the hairdressers a few weeks back, for instance, getting the old grey locks snipped, and the lass who was cutting my hair just jabbering away, packed hairdresser's shop, because it's a ladies section as well, so there's lots of people in. I'm in the gents' chair, and she's cutting away, and just in conversation, I can't remember how she got onto it. She was talking about her husband. There was a bit of a kind of what word she used, but independent-minded, let's say. And she said, "Oh, and he didn't even get vaccinated." And I said, "No, nor did I." And just left it, like just left that. Oh, and everybody in the shop heard it. Now, my guess would be in that shop there'd be some sections who were kind of full-on pro-vaccination. Who thought, oh, he's a COVID idiot, or whatever they used to call us, kind of thing.
Yeah.
He's crazy. But there will be some in there who would be kind of in that. I'm sure we had some skeptics and they thought, yeah,
and people that regret it. As well, people that did get vaccinated and regret doing it now.
Oh, definitely. But the other aspects of the restrictions, whether it's masks, whether it's lockdowns, social distancing, all the other nonsense that they kind of pushed at us, the opportunities do arise. You're in the pub talking to the barman, or in a restaurant with the waiters and waitresses. The opportunities do arise to express skepticism, to express dissent, and to express visibly that you're not on board. And I just think that's important, because I think that does influence people. A bit like negative pressure. If those who have got ambivalence recognise that there's quite a few more people like that out there than they thought,
Yeah.
Of course, with the censorship and
Yeah.
all the propaganda, you got the impression that you're totally on your own.
Yeah.
And when people start thinking we're not alone, a lot more people think like that. That does change minds, and I do think
Yeah.
that's so vitally important.
I think people have changed their minds as well. It's almost like as the fear subsides and people's rational thinking comes back online and they sort of look back over things. And hindsight is a great thing as well, you know, to be able to look back. People do maybe see things from a slightly different perspective, but you're right. This is one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast, is just we've got to keep talking about it. We've got to keep talking about what we went through. Would you say that it's almost like, as a population, we were emotionally abused by our government? Because that's kind of how it felt to me, that we've all sort of been, you know, if I look at what I think emotional abuse to be is, it's trying to use, you know, fear tactics, isolation, you know, pretending that you care about somebody but not treating them in the way that you do care about them. All the things that, just from my sort of, and I'm no expert, I'm not a psychologist or anything, but that's my perspective of what emotional abuse looks like. I just feel like we've all kind of gone through some sort of form of trauma through the pandemic, and we're all kind of coming out and trying to find our way through it afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It is, our government has emotionally abused us, and I'm sure you've seen it, Shirley, too. Some of the memes going around looking at the instances when of domestic abuse, of being kind of emotionally abused by a partner, and the elements that involves, compared to what the government has actually done to its people as a whole, and the parallels are quite striking. You know, kind of gaslighting us, frightening us, planting uncertainty, because everything was uncertain. You didn't know what was going to happen the next day, the next week. Everything was changing. Isolation, separating people off, atomizing society so that people were alone. And remember back in 21, I think it was, I did an article for the People's Lockdown Inquiry, I think it was called then, on the mental health consequences of the restrictions. And I was arguing there that, you know, the three, if you were an evil kind of entity that wanted to inflict as much emotional distress on the population as you possibly could, what would you do? With at least three things. You'd scare them. You'd create extreme uncertainty about what was going to happen in the next few minutes, next hour, next day, and you'd put people in isolation. You'd minimise human contact with peers, etc. And if you think about it, the restrictions were very effective at doing all three of those. You know, the fear is obvious, the isolation and being cut off from other human beings and sources of support is pretty obvious. The uncertainty and unpredictability, if you think about it, you know, I never knew what Boris Johnson was going to announce the following day. You know, anybody's guess. Everything, I mean, everything kept changing, didn't it? Levels of restriction and all that nonsense. And so if there was an evil entity that wanted to create mental health difficulties and emotional distress, that's how to do it. So yes, governments were emotionally abusive.
So as we sort of move forward, firstly, do you have any regrets about speaking out?
None at all. No, none at all. I can honestly say that. I sometimes reflect, you know, I'm not getting any younger, and you look at old friendships with colleagues and that have clearly been soured and are probably beyond retrieval now. Not just the ones that were hostile, openly hostile, but ones that just drifted, largely because of difference of perspective on this topic. You know, sometimes, you know, there's a degree of sadness about that. Life's too short, isn't it, in one way? But overall, no, I couldn't live with myself if I colluded and kept quiet. And And I don't want to blow my own trumpet because I'm a very bit part player. There's lots of people in the skeptical movement who have done and are continuing to do far more than I have. But even I can look at various people around me, family, friends, and I'm pretty confident that what I have done has had some influence on them. There's more skeptics out there now because of my efforts. So that's something I'm going to hang on to, because as I said, we've got to get more people to visibly dissent, otherwise we are in trouble. And so no regrets, no. It was the Righteous Brothers, was it the Walker Brothers once said? It was the Walker Brothers. Show my age there.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. So going forward, I think you're right. I think the level of compliance may be encouraged, more of that behaviour. And so sort of, I think I've heard it described as peaceful non-compliance is a sort of way of going forward. Do you feel quite optimistic about the future? Do you feel that, I sort of think one of the things that came about was people have become organised now. You know, there are groups like Heart and other organisations that have sort of maybe wouldn't have existed had these techniques not been used on us, and had we not had the pandemic experience, which has maybe picked up on things that have been going on for a really long time. Like, you know, would we have even known that there were all these behavioural insight teams and nudge units had the pandemic not happened? So do you feel any kind of optimism moving forward for the future?
Yeah, I cling on to optimism, even though I don't anticipate people being dragged over the coals anytime soon. And also, we are up against it because there's powerful forces at play here. But as you've said, and we both acknowledge, more and more people are beginning to see what motivates some of our kind of institutions in the West. I think it's been one of the problems, actually, Shirley, I think, and still is in many ways. And again, I count myself as being one of these naive people, was that we just struggle to get our heads around the idea that our Western institutions can treat its people the way they have. You know, this thing was, I grew up believing that Western institutions were about freedom and free speech and individual kind of rights, etc., etc. And it was only these places like China and Russia where they had these really authoritarian regimes. But as from 220, I realised that was nonsense, and the West is as bad, and in some cases worse, because they've probably had a bit more influence, a bit more power over the last few decades. Some of the things our Western institutions have got up to over the last 50, 60 years. I think I'm learning every day. Just appalling, and that's quite unsettling. I think to have that trust betrayed, and to start to think, what can I actually accept as being truth? What can what major event over the last 50 years can I actually truly believe occurred in the way I've been told it occurred? And it's as if the dominoes start to kind of tumble. You know, you get sceptical about one thing, and then you start to question and do your research, and then another one goes.
Do you think there's a danger then that we're sort of then more easily led into alternative narratives, and we're not as skeptical about the alternatives that are presented to us? So in order to keep our skepticism, we have to sort of become skeptical from the mainstream narrative, but also some of the alternative narratives as well.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. I think that's right. I think I'm a great believer in holding on to some humility. Nobody, I have arguments with fellow skeptics about this. You know, no one's sussed this out yet, no matter what they say. There's no individual who can, accurately say, I get what's going on. Not least because each and every human being is imperfect in the way they make sense of the world. We all have our biases. When you and I think, have skeptical views, so that will influence the way we think, the way we interpret things, what we remember, what we notice, just like I tried to illustrate earlier in our conversation. So, and we've also got to, each and one of us must cling and hold on to the idea that we might be wrong about, at least about some things. I think that's that humility is important. One, because I think it's a good trait in itself, but also I think it makes us more credible as well and more likely to influence others if we accept that we're fallible ourselves and we don't know. At the end of the day, we don't know a lot about whether this is true or not. But as we've said several times, people are waking up. People are beginning to at least actively consider that we're not always being told the truth by our political and leaders, civil servants, and other key players in the world stage. And that's good. I think that is good. And hopefully we'll hit that critical mass where the authoritarian juggernaut grinds to a halt because they can't keep pushing that, because there's too many people that now get it and understand what's going on.
Definitely. Gary, it's been so lovely to speak to you. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Enjoyed it.
If people want to find out more about what you do, where can they find you?
A few places, really. I have my own Substack, so at Gary Sidley. So it's simple enough. And Substack, a lot of my articles are on there going back to 2020. So there's lots of stuff on there about nudging, mass, and quite a few other things as well, about how to change minds as well. Obviously, as you mentioned, I work still with part of Heart Group, Health Advisory and Recovery Team. So that's heartgroup.org. There's a big website. There's loads and loads of material on there that hopefully your listeners will find of interest. There's smilefree.org, which is the mask, anti-mask mandate little group of us. So quite proud of, actually, because there's only a small group of people with very limited resources. But I think we have kind of ruffled a few feathers and publicised a few things. And that's why, I'll plug again shamelessly, the film maskinghumanity.com. You can find it on YouTube. It doesn't make it easy though, of course, because it's very sensorial thing. And you start putting masking humanity, without typing that into the search engine on YouTube, it doesn't come up kind of immediately. You've got to put the whole thing in and search, and then it comes up. So, so we are proud of that. Well worth a watch. I think it's well made, even though it took long enough, but I think it's well made, and the end product's good. And I think people who've got some degree of
I've watched it. It's really good. It's really good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Share it widely, Shirley.
I will, definitely. I will.
Yeah. That's it, mainly. I've written all sorts of stuff.
And you're on X, aren't you? If people want to come and argue with you on X, you're there. And
well, I'm on X, yeah. Again, at Gary Sidley, I'm on there with my name. And if they're looking for other articles, I've written a lot for The Critic. So you just put The Critic magazine and put Sidley in, they all pop up. As well as the Conservative, it used to be called the Conservative Woman. It's called something different now, isn't it? The Conservative Home, I think, TCW, or something like that. Anyway, what used to be the Conservative Woman, quite a few articles for them, and the good old Daily Skeptic, which again was another source of sanity back in the day. Like the only thing that you could read. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Gary, and thank you for being a COVID skeptic. You certainly helped to keep me sane during the pandemic, and I'll always be really, really grateful for that. And yeah, go and check out Gary's work. We'll put all the links in the show notes. And so if you want to go and check out what he's doing, because I've got a feeling you'll still be out there campaigning and doing your stuff.
Yeah. Thank you for giving me a platform. Cheers.
And thank you everybody for listening today. I look forward to catching up with you soon, speaking to some more COVID skeptics. In the meantime, do take care. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.